Hello, this lecture is entitled White Rose Resistance to National Socialism. Germany became a broken nation. In 1933, there were Germans who could not conceive that Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists would remain in power for over a decade while many citizens watched in passive silence. Early resistance went nowhere. The National Socialists destroyed those who challenged their government. They believed they knew what was best for Germans, and they embraced censorship and repression to keep citizens in their proper place. One impressive example of resistance was the White Rose movement of 1942 and 1943. The small, heroic, underground resistant group of a few university students and one university professor confounded the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police. Hans Scholl, his sister Sophie, and several others risked their lives to share the message to other Germans that Hitler and National Socialist leaders were criminals in the process of destroying Germany. Their courage was phenomenal since they knew that capture by the Gestapo likely meant execution. Once in power, the National Socialists wasted no time revealing their evil thinking. Dated July 14, 1933, one of their first laws was called the Prevention of Offspring of Hereditary Diseases. This law meant the sterilization of manic depressives, cripples, epileptics, and others with blindness. Appeals were through special eugenic courts, but the National Socialists remained ruthless. What the Nazis deemed more important was the purification of the German race. There were many stories of people dying in nursing homes and hospitals. These sudden deaths were mysterious, and the government lied or were evasive of the facts. Of course, the most obvious acts of evil were the attacks on Jewish citizens. The treatment of Jews became increasingly brutal throughout the 1930s. From the very beginning, the National Socialists had been a plague, combining the special interests of their basely impulsive and greedy natures, intellectually speaking, soulless and half-educated, with the true and genuine wishes and claims of the German people. German writer Theodor Hacker wrote in 1940 that the fate and thus the task of the German Christian is without an example which he might follow. He is alone. Everything he feels, thinks, and does has a question mark to it, questioning whether it is right. The leadership of Germany today, and of this there is not the slightest doubt, and it cannot be evaded, is consciously anti-Christian. It hates Christ, whom it does not name. In the face of such evil, there were small pockets of resistance in Germany. The five Scholl children, Inge, Hans, Elizabeth, Sophie, and Warner, had wonderful parents who provided excellent teaching. Robert Scholl was a big man who was quick to give his opinions. He was a man who went his own way. A pacifist during the First World War, he worked as a medic. He did not let government censorship stop him from keeping his family bookshelf stocked with German literature considered unacceptable. Books were written by Jews were forbidden. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels demanded the burning of literature written by Jews and others who were a threat to National Socialist ideas. In contrast to Robert, his wife Magdalena was a gentlewoman and a mother who devoted her life to her family and to their home. Much to the displeasure of his father, Hans enthusiastically joined the Hitler Youth and became a respected leader. He was a squad leader of approximately 140 boys. By 1935, there were almost 4 million members of the all-boys Hitler Youth. In the following year, membership in the Hitler Youth became compulsory for all proper German young males. The youngest daughter of the Scholl family, Sophie, was an unusually reflective young woman. She joined the League of German Girls, the female version of the Hitler Youth. Her father made no serious attempt to stop her. He understood that opponents to tyranny could never be created by force, only by personal experience. All the Scholl children found the initial Nazi years exciting. In the schools and communities, National Socialist activities of wearing uniforms, marching in torchlight processions, and camping in the country were popular. And Scholl remembered the atmosphere of the early years. We heard so much talk about the fatherland and comradeship, the Volk community and love of one's home. This impressed us, and we listened with rapture. We were told that we should live for something greater than ourselves. We were taken seriously in a strange sort of way. The indoctrination of the German youth was overpowering. One stanza of the official Hitler Youth anthem went as follows: Youth, youth, we are the future soldiers. Yes, we'll drop anyone with our fists who tries to stand against us. Führer, we belong to you, we, your comrades. If something bad happened, most German citizens repeated the phrase, if only the Führer knew. The propaganda machine was powerful, and most German citizens had no idea that Hitler was behind the state brutality. There was some conflict in some German homes. Parents who were immune to the nationalist propaganda and who privately opposed the new regime watched in horror as their children slipped away from them. These parents had to be cautious about speaking openly in their own living rooms for fear that their children would report them to their teachers or youth group leaders. It was the youth who embraced state power and authority. Robert Scholl told his children that the Nazis were wolves who misused the German people terribly. When people spoke of a better economy under the National Socialist, he pointed out it came at a high cost. Many jobs were due to the creation of a war industry. The Hitler regime did not allow free market capitalism. In time, the Scholl children sided with their father. Both Hans and Sophie especially became critical of the Hitler Youth movement. In 1937, Hans joined an underground youth group that rejected the conformity of the Hitler Youth. However, the activities of this particular group were mainly social events and had no action against the government. For Sophie, war was meaningless, and she lamented the terrible sacrifices of German soldiers on the front line. At age 16, she met Fritz, 4 years her senior, and they developed a close relationship despite their differences. Loyal to the armed forces of the Third Reich, Fritz was a career soldier. Sophie experienced shock when her father first got in trouble with the Gestapo. His secretary reported to the authorities that she overheard him say in anger that Hitler was a scourge of humanity. As a loyal German, she believed it was her duty to report such talk. The Gestapo arrived soon after and took him away for questioning. They released him, but he would eventually have to go to trial. Sophie found high school an ordeal. National Socialist ideology pervaded every class. Her teachers warned her that her bad attitude could prevent her from graduating. Although she did not comply, she did pass. Her goal was to go to university and specialize in philosophy and biology, hopefully a good antidote to the Nazi racialist ideology. However, before attending university, all female high school graduates had to serve a minimum of 6 months in the National Labor Service. While Sophie was in high school, Hans had entered military service, and his plan was to get over the ordeal as quickly as possible. One day at his base, the Gestapo took him into their prison in Stuttgart, where they questioned him for 3 weeks, determined to get information of any illegal activity. At the personal behest of his cavalry officer, Hans gained his freedom. Delayed in her university studies, Sophie was put in a work camp that was a terrible experience. The accommodations, food, and leadership were brutal. She found it disgusting how the girls submitted without question. The women leaders constantly barked orders. Sophie wrote, "We live like prisoners. Not only work, but leisure time is turned into duty hours." The National Socialists had choked off the voices of moral protest. Most churches remained silent in the face of the brute force of fascism. The Scholls felt the need to act against the government, and Hans was the first to commit. In early 1942, he and his friend Alexander Schmorell went from spiritual resistance to direct opposition to the National Socialists. Alexander bought a second-hand duplication machine at an outrageous price to duplicate their printed messages of protest. The White Rose movement began in the city of Munich. The city had been a leading artistic center of Europe and an elegant, spacious, deeply Catholic city with a long history of monarchy, of separatism, and of provincial reactionary values. In mid-June, the activists mailed hundreds of leaflets to the White Rose to people throughout the city. There were 4 different leaflets. Filled with rage and literary citations, the typed words were single-spaced and on both sides of a sheet of paper. People needed to read about an irresponsible ruling clique motivated by the darkest of instincts. The following sentences from the first leaflet indicates an angry tone. Every individual has to consciously accept his responsibility as a member of Western and Christian civilization in this last hour, to arm himself as best he can to work against the scourge of humanity, against fascism and every other form of the absolute state. Adopt passive resistance, resistance wherever you are, blocking the functioning of this atheistic war machine before it is too late, before the last city is a heap of rubble like Cologne, and before the last youth of our nation bleeds to death because of the hubris of a subhuman. Don't forget that every people gets the government it deserves. The leaflet was unstructured, somewhat confusing, but touching. However, many people turned them over to the Gestapo. Now a university student, Sophie found a leaflet while attending a lecture. She had no evidence of Hans' involvement with the White Rose, but she suspected he had a connection. When she confronted him, he initially denied any involvement with the White Rose. It was impossible for him to keep it secret from Sophie. She was upset, yet she understood there could be no turning back. She too became a member of the White Rose. The young man closely tied to Hans and Sophie was Christoph Probst. Raised as a freethinker, Christoph received baptism in the Catholic Church at the end of his life. He was an intellectual who studied medicine to become a medic. His stepmother was Jewish. Whereas Hans and Sophie were single, Christoph had a wife and 3 children. He played a key role in the White Rose. Another member was Willy Graf, a devout Catholic and medic who had served in Poland and Russia. Seeing the blood and agony of wounded soldiers was bad enough. Worse was the unspeakable cruelty of his fellow soldiers in dealing with unarmed, conquered people. Years earlier, when he was a teenager, he ended his friendship with anyone who joined the Hitler Youth. As much as he hated National Socialism, he found it ethically difficult to take the next step of illegal activity against the government. He would do so, but it was never easy. Professor Kurt Huber also played a significant role in assisting the White Rose movement. Since the mid-1920s, he was a popular professor who taught philosophy, psychology, and musicology courses. When he met Hans and learned of the White Rose, he was 49 years old and not in the best health. Huber viewed the National Socialists as a domestic version of Bolshevism. They were a mass movement of revolutionaries. He detested the left wing. In 1942, throughout 1942, the Gestapo failed to identify and capture the members of the White Rose. In the summer, Sophie finished her university semester and returned home to her family. Hans and her younger brother Warner were both at the front. For his anti-Hitler remark, her father received a sentence of 4 months in prison, and this added to her mother's trauma. Sophie did her best to forget the sadness around her, and with her flute she played songs of freedom. One verse of a 19th century song went as follows. Your thoughts are free. No one can guess them. They flee right by like shadows in the night. No man can know them. No hunter can shoot them with powder and lead. Your thoughts are free. As demanded by the government, Sophie did manual work at a factory, a job she loathed. Many of those working in the factory were women laborers from Russia. The Russian girls lived in barracks behind barbed wire in a compound near the factory. The National Socialists made them work 70 hours a week on meager food. A kind-hearted young woman, Sophie made friends with a few of the Russian girls. Despite the heavy propaganda by Goebbels, the Germans were not doing well on the Russian front. And in early 1943, the troops were at a point of exhaustion with inadequate clothes and supplies. On February the 3rd, there was a radio announcement that the German Sixth Army lost the Battle of Stalingrad. It was a gigantic setback for the Nazi machine. The Gestapo doubled its efforts to destroy resistance movements at home. At this time, the White Rose operation was having a resurgence and expansion throughout southwest Germany. The fifth leaflet received stylistic suggestions from Professor Huber. Unlike the leaflets of 1942, the name White Rose did not appear on the leaflet. The group's new title was Leaflets of the Resistance Movement in Germany. The leaflet was titled A Call to All Germans. The group acquired a larger duplicating machine and distributed approximately 10,000 leaflets, 20 times more than the first 4 leaflets. The leaflets showed up in Munich, Stuttgart, Vienna, Ulm, Frankfurt, and Augsburg. To increase their impact, the activists transported the leaflets in suitcases and backpacks by train to other cities and mailed them from there to yet another city. All German citizens had to carry identification papers, and thus the activists were taking a huge risk with their train incursions. Hans, Alexander, and Willy also painted freedom and down with Hitler on the Feldherrnhall monument, which was the site of Hitler's unsuccessful insurrection in 1923. 10 years later, in power, Hitler had put a memorial plaque to his martyred stormtroopers. To desecrate the so-called Temple of the Third Reich was unthinkable. Christoph told his friends that such stunts were too risky. The National Socialists were more dangerous since they had experienced military setbacks. Some German citizens lost their lives for simply saying out loud that the war was not going well. Christoph, however, agreed with his friends that another leaflet was in order. On February the 18th, Hans and Sophie arrived at the university with a large suitcase full of leaflets. Arriving while lectures were in progress, they took the leaflets written by Kurt Huber and placed batches of them in front of the doors of lecture halls, on windowsills, and on stairs. They were about to leave, but noticed there were still some leaflets left in the suitcase. They went to the upper floor and scattered the leaflets down into the foyer. At that moment, many students exited the lecture rooms. At the same time, Jacob Schmid, a middle-aged custodian who was a member of the SA, identified Hans and Sophie carrying out their illegal act. He shouted at them, "You're under arrest." Hans and Sophie tried to escape, but the custodian caught up to them and they stopped running. The university administrators notified the Gestapo, who arrived and took them away in handcuffs. The interrogation lasted 17 hours. Separated, Hans and Sophie each denied any involvement. However, in the face of additional evidence against them, they confessed, saying that they alone were responsible. The Gestapo put them in separate cells. Each had a cell inmate whose duty was to stop any suicide attempt. A woman named Else Jibbo was with Sophie, and she marveled at Sophie's courage. Sophie could save her life by declaring herself for National Socialism, but she refused. The Gestapo tracked down the other members of the White Rose. Christoph was next, and he was in custody the day after the Scholl's arrest. On February 22nd, 4 days after the incident, Hans, Sophie, and Christoph began their so-called trial at Munich's Palace of Justice. Roland Friesler was the presiding judge of the infamous People's Court, where the outcome was never in doubt. Friesler, who was a devout Bolshevik during World War I, was a loyal National Socialist. A great admirer of Stalin's techniques of terror, he represented court abuse, degradation, and death. In the book Sophie Scholl and the White Rose, author Annette Dumbach and Jude Newborn described Friesler's treatment of the three accused. It seemed impossible to believe the string of charges, oaths, attacks, and insults that Friesler now unleashed against them. He seemed out of control. It was his style, since he had become so notorious as Hitler's hanging judge. He seemed to revel in a kind of dementia that was turned off and on again without warning. The chamber was filled with silence and terror. This crazed man in dazzling red could do precisely as he wished, and they all knew it. When Robert Scholl forced his way into the chamber in an attempt to defend his children, Friesler shrieked at the top of his lungs for the father to be removed from the court. Scholl's parting words were that there is a higher justice, and they will go down in history, referring to the White Rose activists. Before he was escorted out to the prison, Hans called out to Friesler, "You will soon stand where we stand now." At Stadelheim prison, the Scholl parents had one last opportunity to see their children. Sophie's mother cried that she would never see her daughter again. Sophie was only 21 years old. "Oh, mother," Sophie said, still smiling, "what are those few years anyway?" "Sophie, remember Jesus," her mother said. "Yes, but you too," she replied. 3 hours after the end of the trial, Sophie, Hans, and Christoph were escorted to a small building where there was a guillotine. Hands shouted out, "Long live freedom." Within minutes, it was over. It was February 22nd, and the National Socialists had beheaded 3 university students for their wrong think. Days later, other loyal National Socialist university students vented their anger at the White Rose members, who they saw as traitors to Hitler's Germany. They gave Jacob Schmid a resounding ovation for his heroic role in exposing the White Rose members. Over the next week, the National Socialists rounded up the other members of the White Rose. The second trial at Friesler's People's Court took place on April 19th. Kurt Huber expected another professor to be his character witness, but the professor did not show up. The executions of Huber and Alexander were carried out on July 13th. Willie was executed on October 12th. The White Rose members were dead, but the leaflets were reprinted by others and dropped from Allied aircraft over German cities. Elsewhere, German novelist Thomas Mann, living in exile, read the leaflets and cried with joy. The leaflets were a testimony that within Germany, within Nazi Germany, there were people who still cared about freedom. The National Socialists demanded obedience. The authoritarians embraced censorship to keep people in line with government thinking. Controlling the media, the German leaders promoted the narrative that it was necessary for the people to endure sacrifices for the fatherland. Tough measures and a reset for a new Germany were necessary. White Rose members were wise to the government lies, and they lost their lives for speaking up. 18th century German philosopher and historian Friedrich Schiller wrote, "The first law of decency is to preserve the liberty of others. The second is to demonstrate one's own freedom." Thank you.